I think my mother did exactly the right thing. I think it's absolutely extraordinary that any right-minded thinking parent should believe that it was the...
1 minute was all it took for decades of royal silence to shatter. Why would Princess Anne, the quiet backbone of the monarchy, speak now? For decades, she had been the reliable figure, the steady hand who never courted the cameras, never sought to upstage her family. But today, the world stood still as her voice rang out across television screens and news feeds, blunt and deliberate, with none of the carefully choreographed grace the monarchy has come to rely on. With a few measured sentences, Anne pulled back the veil on something the royal family had fought to keep hidden, and left every royal watcher, journalist, and palace aide scrambling to understand what exactly she had just done. Her words did not come draped in ceremonial language or wrapped in the comfort of platitudes. They cut straight through the polite facade that the family has used for generations to shield itself from scrutiny. One by one, her sentences struck like hammers on glass, and the cracks were impossible to ignore. Within seconds, questions erupted. Was she protecting someone vulnerable? Was she revealing something that others had tried to bury? Or was this simply Anne being Anne, fearless, loyal, and entirely unafraid to confront what everyone else would rather ignore? In the stunned silence that followed her speech, the weight of her words settled over Buckingham Palace like a storm cloud. Staff exchanged worried glances, whispers traveled faster than footsteps, and even the most seasoned royal commentators were left scrambling to find meaning in her declaration. Because what she said didn't just sound like a rebuke, it felt like a reckoning. Her pointed remarks seemed to strike at fractures buried deep in the family, cracks that began forming decades ago, but had only grown wider with every scandal, betrayal, and compromise of principle. This was not just about the present. It was about everything the family had failed to confront and everything it had tried to forget. And yet, in her characteristic way, Anne spoke not as a politician or a performer, but as someone who has lived and breathed the burden of this institution every day of her life. Every word she chose carried weight, and the silence that followed each sentence was more deafening than applause ever could be. Those who have watched the monarchy closely knew instantly that this was not some impulsive outburst. Anne had waited. She had watched. She had chosen her moment with the precision of someone who understands that timing is everything in a family where nothing and no one is left to chance. Her words were calculated to reach not just the press or the public, but her family itself, a message delivered like a quiet dagger rather than a roaring battle cry. What stood out most was not just what she said, but what it meant. She was not simply airing grievances, she was drawing a line in the sand. And that line cut straight through the heart of the monarchy, leaving no one, not even the king, untouched. It signaled that whatever storms were brewing behind palace walls were about to break into full view of the world, and if her words were any indication, she was not afraid of what would come next. To understand the magnitude of Anne's words, we must first peer into the hidden cracks of the royal family that have been widening for years. Long before Anne spoke, whispers in the palace corridors hinted at something dangerous brewing behind the gilded doors. The royal facade, so carefully polished for the public eye, had begun to crack after Diana's tragic death, and those cracks had deepened into wounds that no amount of ceremony could conceal. Her loss wasn't just personal, it had fractured the family's very foundation, leaving behind scars that would fester in silence. Within the halls of Buckingham and Windsor, the grief remained unspoken but omnipresent, shaping every glance, every decision, and every betrayal that followed. In that silence, the air thickened with something far darker than mourning: resentment, mistrust, and ambition growing like vines through the marble. Kate bore that weight more than anyone dared to acknowledge. To the world, she appeared composed, flawless, even smiling gracefully at charity events, waving from balconies with regal ease. But behind closed doors, her quiet suffering mirrored Diana's own. Every smile was a shield, hiding exhaustion and doubt. Every appearance is a performance, concealing the loneliness and pressure that came with standing in Diana's shadow, while navigating the same cold machinery that had once chewed Diana up and spat her out. Those closest to her saw the truth in fleeting moments. A tremor in her voice, a distant look in her eyes revealing the strain she carried in silence. William, too, found himself ensnared in the invisible web of loyalty and resentment. Torn between his duty to his father and his instinct to protect Kate, he began to see how his father's favoritism toward Camilla had grown undeniable. Charles leaned more and more on Camilla's advice, sidelining William's concerns as if they were the naive objections of a child. And as Camilla's influence grew unchecked, she became emboldened, weaving herself deeper into decisions that ought to have been William's to make. To William, it felt less like guidance and more like usurpation, as though every move she made was one more step into Diana's space, one more attempt to rewrite history and claim a place she had never truly earned. All the while, Anne watched. She moved quietly through the family drama, her sharp eyes cataloging every slight, every maneuver, every betrayal. She was never one to speak unless it mattered, but it was clear she was paying attention. She noticed the small things others ignored, the way aides glanced at each other when Camilla issued a decree, the way Kate's hands tightened on her lap when snubbed in public, the way William's jaw set whenever his father dismissed him. Anne saw it all, and in her silence, she carried the weight of truths no one else dared to name. And in the shadows of this tense family drama, a quiet alliance was forming, one no one expected. Behind palace curtains, Anne found a kindred spirit in Kate, an alliance born from respect, not ambition. It was in the quietest moments, when the cameras had stopped flashing and the chatter faded to whispers, that their connection became undeniable. Anne, so often the lone sentinel of duty in a family consumed by image and intrigue, recognized something rare in Kate. She saw a quiet strength that didn't clamor for attention, a grace that bore the weight of expectation without cracking under it. To Anne, Kate was not just a wife or a duchess, but a figure of substance, embodying the same resilience she had once admired in Diana, yet tempered with a calm Anne herself had never been able to master. These were not superficial exchanges for show. Their bond was not woven in rehearsed smiles and staged photo opportunities, but in fleeting, almost invisible moments of solidarity. During tense dinners, Anne would catch Kate's eye across the table and offer the faintest of nods, a silent reassurance that she wasn't alone. At family gatherings, Anne would gently pull her aside, placing a steady hand on her arm as she whispered quiet words of encouragement, words meant not to comfort, but to remind her of her place, her power, and her right to stand firm. Anne could see how Kate bore the impossible, the relentless comparisons to Diana, the constant scrutiny, the subtle yet cruel slights from within the family. And as Anne watched her navigate it all without bitterness or theatrics, she couldn't help but see in her the same fire Diana carried, only steadier, more controlled, and far less vulnerable to being extinguished. To Anne, Kate was more than a future queen. She was living proof that the crown could still mean something noble, something worth fighting for. But in the shadows, their quiet connection did not go unnoticed. Camilla, so attuned to any shift in loyalty, began to sense what was growing between them. At first, it was little more than unease and inkling that Anne's cold distance toward her was no longer just personal but strategic. But as the weeks passed, that unease hardened into something sharper, something more dangerous. She began to see Anne's encouragement of Kate not as harmless mentorship but as a threat, a deliberate undermining of her place at Charles's side and her influence over the monarchy's future. Anne, however, did not flinch. Her loyalty to Kate was unspoken but absolute. In quiet corridors, she began to offer guidance on how to play the game, but on how to endure it. She showed Kate how to deflect attacks without appearing defensive, how to hold her ground without creating open conflict, how to let her deeds speak when words would only be used against her. But Anne's loyalty didn't only extend to Kate, she was also guarding something much bigger, the Queen's final wishes. What if the late Queen left behind more than just a crown? What if she entrusted Anne with her true vision for the monarchy? In her final years, Queen Elizabeth grew quieter in public, but far more candid in private, and it was to Anne, her most steadfast, unyielding child, that she revealed the doubts and fears she dared not confess to anyone else. Behind closed doors at Balmoral and Windsor, the Queen laid bare her unease about what was unfolding under her very nose. She worried not for herself, but for the institution she had carried on her shoulders for 7 decades, an institution now threatened from within. Her voice, so often a symbol of unshakable resolve, wavered as she confided to Anne her deep concerns about Camilla's rising influence. The Queen, though gracious in public, could see the subtle shifts of power, the way Charles leaned more and more on Camilla, letting her shape decisions that were meant to belong to the heir. Elizabeth spoke, too, of Diana's legacy, how her absence had left a wound the family had never healed, how the public still clung to the memory of the woman they called the Queen of Hearts. That memory, the Queen admitted, haunted her, a reminder of promises unfulfilled and mistakes that could not be erased. Her hopes for the future were simple yet profound. She wished not just for continuity, but for dignity. She spoke of William and Kate as the rightful torchbearers of that future, young enough to adapt, yet strong enough to uphold the crown's gravitas. She admired their humility, their quiet determination to serve rather than dominate, and she feared that without them, the monarchy would drift even further from its purpose. It was not enough, she said, to wear the crown. One had to deserve it. Anne listened without interrupting, absorbing each word with the weight it deserved. And when the Queen, in her most vulnerable moment, extracted a promise from her only daughter to protect that vision to ensure that the future belonged to those who understood its meaning, Anne did not hesitate. She swore to honor her mother's wishes, even if it meant standing against her own blood. That promise became the quiet fire in Anne's chest, the reason she held her tongue for so long, and the reason she finally chose to break it. The secrets she carried were no longer here to guard. They belonged to the monarchy, and to the people who believed in it. And as Anne carried the weight of these confidences, Camilla began sensing the ground shifting beneath her feet. As Anne's silence grew heavier, Camilla's confidence began to crack. Could her carefully built facade withstand the truth? At first, Camilla tried to dismiss it, telling herself that Anne's coldness had always been there, just another thorn in a crown full of grudges. But this time, it felt different. There was something in Anne's gaze, sharper, heavier, as though she carried knowledge that could shatter everything. And for the first time since she'd clawed her way to legitimacy, Camilla felt the ground beneath her shift. The quiet disapproval in Anne's eyes was not just disapproval anymore, it was a warning. Restlessness began to seep into every corner of Camilla's day. She called hurried meetings with her closest advisors, trying to get ahead of whatever Anne might say. Her private secretary was instructed to schedule calls with MPs who still backed her, to craft statements emphasizing unity, to remind everyone that she, not Anne, stood beside the king. But the more she strategized, the more the truth gnawed at her. Anne's words didn't need embellishment. They didn't even need names. Everyone would understand exactly who she meant, and that realization became her quiet terror. For years, she had worked to rehabilitate her image, to distance herself from the woman who had once been blamed for Diana's suffering. She thought she had succeeded, that the public had finally begun to see her as a dignified consort, not a usurper. But as Anne's presence loomed larger, that illusion felt fragile, a house of glass waiting for the first stone. Camilla began to fear not just for herself, but for her very place in the royal narrative. She could feel the public sentiment slipping through her fingers. The affection they had for Kate had only grown, and in their eyes, Kate was no longer just a duchess but the true heir to Diana's grave. Every time Kate appeared in public, smiling softly despite her quiet struggles, it reminded people of everything they had lost with Diana and everything they hoped to see again in Kate. Camilla knew she could never compete with that. The more she tried to claim authority, the colder the public became, as though they could sense the ambition pulsing beneath her smiles. But Anne's quiet resolve was the final blow. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was worse than that. Anne's silence was a threat that didn't need words. Every knowing glance, every clipped sentence, every measured pause reminded Camilla that she was not untouchable, that at any moment, Anne could speak and unravel everything she had fought to secure. And the more Anne watched, the more Camilla wondered just how much she truly knew. While Camilla scrambled to protect herself, Anne's words reached those who needed them most, William and Kate. For William and Kate, Anne's declaration was more than a statement. It was a lifeline in a sea of palace politics. In a world where even their smallest actions were scrutinized, criticized, and twisted into headlines, Anne's words cut through the noise like a beacon. For the first time in years, someone had stood publicly and unequivocally on their side. And it wasn't just anyone, it was Anne, the unwavering guardian of duty, the one royal whose loyalty had never been in question. Her voice carried more than authority, it carried weight, and both William and Kate felt it in their bones. Kate, who had endured so much in silence, felt something stir within her as she listened. For years, she had smiled through the strain, holding herself together under the crushing expectations of a family that still measured her against a ghost. Every glance from Camilla, every subtle dismissal at official events, every whispered comparison to Diana had etched itself into her spirit. But now, Anne has validated all of it. She had named the struggle without naming names, and Kate felt, perhaps for the first time since her wedding day, that she belonged not just as a wife, but as an heir to the throne's deeper meaning. For William, it was a moment of clarity. He had grown up knowing the monarchy needed to change, feeling the sting of his mother's pain, and swearing privately that history would not repeat itself. Yet so often he found himself trapped, hemmed in by his father's decisions and Camilla's growing dominance. But Anne's declaration cracked that wall. In her defiance, he saw a way forward, a vision of the monarchy aligned not with tradition for tradition's sake, but with service, humility, and the values his mother had embodied. It wasn't just an endorsement, it was permission to finally act. In the quiet after Anne's speech, William sought her out privately. There were no cameras, no scripted remarks, just a quiet exchange where he thanked her, not only for her courage but for her faith in him and Kate. For the first time in years, he felt seen, understood not as a figurehead, not as a future king, but as a man who had been carrying a burden too heavy to shoulder alone. Anne, true to form, said little in response, but her eyes told him everything. He was not alone anymore. In that rare moment of unity, William and Kate shared something almost forgotten in the royal family: determination laced with hope. Together, they resolved not just to survive, but to lead in a way that would honor Diana's legacy and restore meaning to the crown. But Anne's announcement wasn't just about the present. It was a reckoning with the monarchy's past and its path to the future. Even decades after her passing, Diana's shadow still dances in the palace halls, a reminder of what was lost and what could be regained. Her pain had exposed a coldness in the monarchy the world had never seen so clearly before, a rigidity that fractured under the weight of her humanity. Every tear she shed in public, every lonely glance, every quiet act of rebellion cracked the illusion of perfection and revealed a family more concerned with preserving its image than protecting its own. That truth, once seen, could never be unseen, and it has lingered like a ghost haunting every corner of Buckingham Palace, whispering that the crown must learn to feel or risk losing everything. Her vision of a monarchy rooted in compassion rather than ceremony has not faded. It lives on in William and Kate, who have quietly carried forward her dream of making the crown more human. Their smiles at hospitals, their hands extended to ordinary people, their refusal to fully retreat behind the walls of privilege, all of it speaks to Diana's belief that service must mean more than spectacle. And though they've never spoken of it openly, the way they carry themselves is an unspoken promise to her memory, that her suffering would not be in vain. Even Queen Elizabeth, as her reign drew to its close, came to understand this. In private conversations with Anne, she admitted that the monarchy could no longer afford to ignore the lesson Diana's life and death had taught them. She feared that if the crown continued down its path of detachment, it would lose the people completely. And though she never dared to say so publicly, she entrusted Anne with that fear, and with the responsibility of making sure that Diana's quiet revolution would not be erased by those who had most to lose from it. Anne's declaration, then, was not just her own. It was an echo of Diana's voice, a continuation of her fight. By standing in front of the cameras and speaking about duty, humility, and the dangers of unchecked ambition, Anne ensured that Diana's memory shaped not just the past, but the future. She turned what many thought was a tragedy, resigned to history, into a force that still had the power to demand change. Yet for Camilla, the ghost of Diana remains her greatest threat. No matter how carefully she has rebuilt her image, no matter how many years have passed, the public's affection for Diana remains unshaken. Every word from Anne seemed to magnify that divide, reminding the world that while Camilla claimed a place in the monarchy, it was one Diana never willingly surrendered. And so Anne's words didn't just vindicate William and Kate, they rekindled the memory of a woman whose heart still beats in the nation's conscience. Now, with the world watching, Anne delivered the line that would echo through history. With calm determination, Anne looked into the cameras and spoke words that would shake Buckingham Palace to its foundation. For years, her silence had been her shield, but now, every syllable cut through centuries of royal protocol like a blade. She began not with accusation, but with principle, reminding everyone listening that the monarchy's survival depended not on its pageantry, but on its integrity. Accountability, humility, and the courage to honor promises made in quieter times, she said, were the true pillars of the crown. And if those who wore it forgot that, then the crown itself was at risk of crumbling into irrelevance. Without naming names, Anne's message was unmistakable. She condemned those grasping for power at the expense of unity, their ambition cloaked in false devotion. Every word was a mirror held up to the palace's darkest corners, And in that reflection stood Camilla, her influence glaring in its distortion of what the monarchy was meant to represent. Anne's voice never faltered, but the weight of her meaning hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. She did not simply call for change, she outlined it. Advocating for a monarchy stripped of its excess and focused instead on service, she envisioned a royal family led not by entitlement, but by those who embodied the values it was meant to symbolize. Her tone carried no malice, only an unflinching resolve to say what others could not. And then came the line that left the palace frozen in its tracks, a sentence already etched into history before it had even finished leaving her lips. "We have a duty to protect the future, not the past." The statement was as much a challenge as it was a warning to those clinging desperately to old illusions, to those who believed the monarchy could continue hiding behind gilded walls, while its foundation eroded beneath them. Anne made it clear that silence and illusion would no longer suffice, that the time for veiled threats and quiet submission had ended, and for the first time in living memory, it was not the king's voice that commanded the nation's attention, but his sister's. Her message left no room for comfort. It demanded that everyone who called themselves royal reckoned with the reality that the world had changed and the monarchy would have to change with it. The air in the room seemed to thicken with the implications of her words, as if she had just unlocked a door no one would ever be able to close again. And as the palace scrambled to respond, Anne's final words reverberated in every royal heart, sparking both fear and resolve. Anne's words didn't just expose the cracks in the monarchy, they lit a path forward for those brave enough to follow. For William and Kate, her declaration transformed quiet endurance into decisive purpose. Where once they had tiptoed through a labyrinth of unspoken rules and subtle power plays, now they felt unshackled, emboldened to embrace a vision of the monarchy rooted in honesty and humility. With Anne's support and the memory of Diana and the Queen guiding them, they began to see that leadership did not mean preserving the past at all costs. It meant building something worthy of the future. For Camilla, however, Anne's words landed like a quiet defeat. The confidence she had so carefully cultivated for years gave way to a dawning realization. Her influence was fragile, her place far from secure. No frantic meeting or polished statement could erase the weight of Anne's declaration. Camilla found herself retreating into the background, the whispers of public sentiment louder than any reassurance Charles could offer. Every glance at the headlines reminded her of how quickly the tides could turn and that she was no longer the one shaping them. Meanwhile, Anne stood resolute, her position now clearer than ever before. In that single speech, she cemented herself as the custodian of both the Queen's and Diana's legacies. She had honored her mother's dying wishes and ensured that Diana's memory was not buried beneath layers of royal tradition and ambition. Anne became more than the family's workhorse. More than the silent observer, she became the conscience of the crown. A reminder that integrity mattered more than appearance, and that courage still had a place in the palace. For the public, it was a moment of revelation. They watched a monarchy finally confront its flaws with courage rather than denial. No longer just a relic of the past, it began to look for the first time in decades like an institution willing to grow, to learn, and to earn the respect of those it claimed to serve. The contrast between what the monarchy had been and what it could become was stark, and for many, hopeful. And so, the future seemed to stir awake, not with fanfare or proclamation, but with quiet resolve carried by those who understood what the crown was meant to symbolize. Change was no longer a distant dream whispered in private. It was here, carried on the shoulders of William and Kate, guided by Anne's unwavering hand. The rightful heirs stood ready, and the world was watching. Princess Anne reminded the world and her family that the crown is not just a symbol of power, but a promise of service and integrity. And that promise is no longer negotiable. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.